Hi everyone, and welcome back to Ideanthro, where I'm very excited because we have a guest again. We're trying to do a little bit more of this, and our guest is Hector Sear. Now, I met Hector yesterday at the New Zealand Stormwater Conference, where he gave a presentation on all sorts of things, American stormwater, and water in general, really, more than just stormwater. But one thing grabbed me in particular. You might remember back in a previous Ideanthro episode, we had a presentation from Andy Reese, who's an American fellow with an experience in stormwater utilities. So this is an institutional arrangement, I suppose, of how we can set up. It doesn't have to be an organization, it's an entity, I suppose, to help us manage our stormwater infrastructure. Hector has a long history with stormwater utilities and knows Andy from way back in the day.
Yep.
So we're going to continue that conversation about stormwater utilities, what they are, why they might be of interest in the Australian context, or why they might not. So Hector, do you want to give a little introduction? Who are you?
Just as a bit of introduction and some of the background on stormwater utilities, how they came about. I am now a consultant and have been setting up stormwater utilities around the United States and in Canada, and I've done some work in Australia and New Zealand for about 40 years. In 1974, some far-sighted people in the city of Bellevue, Washington, had this novel idea that they would manage and fund stormwater in the same way that water supply and wastewater treatment is funded. And that concept is what came to be known as a stormwater utility. I was doing some work in the central Puget Sound area, the greater Seattle area, and I knew some of the officials at the city of Bellevue. And for whatever reason, they thought it was wise to hire me to set up this stormwater utility.
Okay.
We had worked together on other things, and they knew that I could work without a script and do something that was different than what standard practice was. And the stormwater utility then, in 1974, was really just an idea. And the Bellevue utility, which we actually named a storm and surface water utility, was the first one in the country.
Okay.
Subsequent to that, I was involved in, still a city employee in Bellevue, I was involved in helping King County and other communities in the Washington and Oregon area as they looked at the stormwater utility concept and thought it might transfer to their situations. And after about 4 or 5 years of helping other places do this, and having a city manager in Bellevue who was very supportive in terms of sharing what we had experienced with them, it dawned on me that I could perhaps sell this instead of giving it away.
Yep.
And so then I set up my consulting firm in 1978, and it's basically what I've been doing ever since. All over the United States, in some provinces in Canada, western provinces, a little bit of work in Australia, a little bit of work in New Zealand, and so on. The stormwater utility, we started with nothing.
Okay.
We didn't have a plan, we didn't have any idea. We were making it up as we went.
So was it
every day?
So was it a case of so did you come into that project with a case of we know we need something different, but we don't yet know what it might look like? Okay.
Exactly. My previous experience as a program manager at an economic development district was starting with a clean slate and building a program to try to help the Puget Sound recovery from the Boeing bust in the early 70s, when there was a billboard in the city that said, "Will the last person leaving Seattle please turn out the lights?"
Right. Okay.
There was 16% unemployment.
Okay.
It was pretty bad, and I had worked for 2 years in building various infrastructure programs to attract, hopefully, investment in business in the Puget Sound area. So they knew that I could start with a blank slate and make something come together.
Yep.
And my educational background was in coastal zone management, so I knew a little bit about water, but I really didn't know much about stormwater. But I knew how to put the program together. I knew how to attach the funding part of it to the program strategy and make it all work. But we were truly guessing.
Yeah, so what was the driver that initially made the people of the city say, well, we need something? Like, what was the problem they were trying to solve?
It was different than I have ever encountered anywhere else in 40 years. The objective in Bellevue from the beginning was to save a stream system in an urban environment that still has salmon spawning in it. A lot of people moved to Bellevue. It went from 4,000 people in 1955 to 70,000 in 1968. Very rapid growth. And the people who moved there early on moved there because of the environmental quality. And they saw all the development and growth going on, which was threatening the vitality, the very existence of those streams. And they didn't want that to happen. Bellevue developed so quickly that the streams didn't get put underground. And that was the key. The streams were still open and coursing through the city. And they wanted to save that. And that's what the stormwater utility in Bellevue was really all about, was the streams and the water quality. It wasn't about building pipes and other infrastructure, although we did that.
Which is different to some of the ones that followed, yeah?
It's very different. It's a very different concept of managing stormwater than almost any place else I've ever been. Retaining the open systems, making use of them as critical components of the infrastructure and protecting them for the values of fish and recreation and so on and so forth. And so it was a different objective than most places. A lot of places have drainage systems that are formal physical structures of pipes and open conduits and so on. And Bellevue has some of that. But what sets it apart is a relatively intricate stream system. There's probably a half a dozen or more watersheds, very small watersheds with open streams. A lot of the streams you can jump across. They're 6 feet wide and a foot deep. So that's where we started. And that water quality and stream orientation has pretty much prevailed all the way through. Now, there's been a whole lot of investment in other infrastructure, major detention ponds, major piped sections and so on. And we had some of that even in the early days, but the key to the whole puzzle was that Bellevue developed so rapidly from 55 to 69 or 70 that they didn't think to put the pipes down and run the streams through the pipes. And so we had a different template to work with.
So, sorry to interrupt there.
No, that's fine.
Where do I want to go? How does the utility differ from what was there before, whether it's Bellevue or another? Like, what actually makes a utility here?
The utility, well, of course, now we were working with a blank slate, so we were constantly asking, how are we going to do this? How are we going to do this part? How are we going to do that part? How are we going to preserve the streams? What are we going to do about water quality? And very important, how are we going to pay for this? And it had already occurred to the leaders in Bellevue that we had a template, we had a model to work from in the existing water supply and wastewater utilities, which were financially based on user fees, charges to customers who were putting service demands on the water system, service demands on the wastewater system. Well, the same sort of circumstances exist in stormwater. You have customers, property owners, who are putting service demands on the stormwater system, whether it's open streams or whether it's pipe systems or whatever. They need to have the stormwater captured and conveyed and properly discharged. So the properties aren't damaged, people aren't endangered, public health is not compromised, and so on. So that was the model we worked from. We're going to do this in the same way that water supply and wastewater treatment are done. And in the United States, that is generally referred to as a utility, a municipal utility. What sets a utility apart is that it is financially self-sufficient, generating its own revenue stream, independent of general taxes and other revenues that a city or a county may, well, undoubtedly has. And so you had a different model of funding in the sense that the customer was paying, the user was paying. You had a different model in the sense that it was separate from general government. separate
Okay.
from police, separate from fire. We didn't have to compete with police and fire for the limited budget dollars.
Yep.
We had our own revenue stream. And the key with utilities is, and when I've done this all over the country, we try to establish a stable revenue stream that's adequate for the purpose, how much money is needed, that is flexible enough to deal with capital improvements, operations, administration, regulatory programs, water quality as well as water quantity,
Yep.
and so on. So you have to have a structure in the funding methodology, in the rate design, that is flexible enough to deal with all these different things. And in the United States, a lot of funding is oriented to one or another of those functions. For
Okay.
example, there are dedicated funding mechanisms for capital infrastructure
Okay.
that legally cannot be used for operations.
Yeah.
There are other limitations on various forms of funding. In some cases, we have assessments to specifically benefited properties. You can't assess properties that aren't benefited by an improvement.
Okay.
And so it's usually a limited geographical area that is benefited by by sidewalks or by a park or whatever, and you have a special assessment just to those properties. So we're working with all those different forms of funding, and quite often, especially today, when we set up a utility, we aren't relying entirely on the user pays service fee,
Okay.
but we're blending maybe as many as a half a dozen different funding mechanisms
Okay.
for various parts of the program. But the foundation has always been the user pays service fee concept. And finally, I talked about having stable revenue stream that was adequate to the purpose and was flexible enough to deal with everything. The final piece of the puzzle is it has to be equitable in order to gain the public acceptance that's necessary politically.
Yep.
And so the acronym I often use is SAFE.
Yep.
SAFE.
Yep.
Stable, adequate, flexible, equitable. And it's not complicated. Some things are a bit demanding technically, so that you, for example, have a rate design that is appropriate in its apportionment of the costs among the
Yes.
ratepayers,
Yes.
and fits with perhaps state laws. Over the last, almost the entire 40 years, but particularly the last 25 years, I've spent a lot of time as an expert witness,
Okay.
looking at the rate designs that various communities have employed and so on, and whether or not they in fact stand up to the technical standards that apply to rate design generally for utilities. And of course, what was our reference point? Water utilities, sewer utilities, solid waste utilities that have gone before. That's what we always looked at when we were doing the stormwater utility, is how was it done by others. We weren't trying to create something new. We weren't trying to recreate the wheel. We were just looking for what worked.
Yep.
And that's what it's been.
So the question that is burning, and this is the question that's actually been burning since I first met Andy, like best part of a year or so ago, and this, how are these utilities received by the public? And
Mixed.
yeah, because the reason I asked this is it sounds like there are benefits to be had, but on the flip side, I have jumped online and searched for a little bit of this, and it's not hard to find things on Facebook where there's some some aggro.
Rain tax.
Yes, exactly.
And things like that. But what we have found works in terms of engaging a community and in engaging people. And the Bellevue utility got sued.
Okay.
The first one in the country got sued. We went to court. We won. We had done it right, fortunately. But one of the interesting things that came out of that was that the city council formed an advisory committee of citizens. And I insisted that on that advisory committee, one of the members be the guy who sued us.
Right.
It was
okay.
a local automobile dealership owner.
Okay.
And the approach we took was just to ask a series of pretty simple questions of the people on this advisory committee. And this is a pattern, this is a practice I have followed for 45 years now.
Okay.
We still do it this way. Is there a problem? Well, in most communities, stormwater has not been well cared for years, and typically there's a problem. Okay? Do we need to solve it? Most communities will say, yes, there's a problem, and yes, we want to solve it. That's why we're here. And then the questions sort of divide into different paths, but we still follow sort of a general pattern of, okay, what do we need to do to solve it? What is the program? Do we need to focus initially on operations and maintenance of the legacy system that's not working very well? Do we need to make huge capital improvements, put in new infrastructure and so on? Do we need to put in a water quality program? What is it that we need to do to fix the problem?
Yeah.
Then, okay, if that's what we need to do, whatever the mix is of operations, capital, water quality, flood control, how are we going to pay for it? What are the alternatives available? And I don't initiate an engagement with a client on the premise that it's going to be a utility with a service fee.
Okay.
There may be other funding mechanisms and other management approaches that work better, and that's fine. For example, a lot of my clients in recent years have been either water supply providers or wastewater treatment operators.
Okay.
And they may have resources and people and so on and so forth that you can integrate the stormwater management objectives into without creating an entirely new animal on the farm,
Sure.
And so I'm not absolutely linked to the idea of a stormwater utility as the only solution. I have found, however, that it has a lot of advantages.
Yeah. So is it a case that the process is key?
The process is what it's all about.
Yeah, and the process does often come back to a utility, but it doesn't necessarily have
That may be the answer at the end of the process,
okay.
but that's absolutely right. The process that we follow has basically 4 tracks of work as we're going through the questions and answers. Is there a problem? Do we need to solve it? Etc. First of all, one track of work focuses on the program itself. What are the problems? How do we approach solving those? What do we need in terms of the components of the organization, and so on. Second track of work is funding. How much money is it going to take to solve this, and where are we going to get it? A third track of the work is data.
Okay.
Because a lot of what you have to do in developing a stormwater program, whether it's a utility or not, is data dependent.
Okay.
We need to know about the systems. We need to know how much stormwater infrastructure there is, because that is a big definer of what you need to do to maintain it. We need to know some things about its age. How fast is it decaying? And then finally, the fourth track is the involvement of the public.
Okay.
The education and involvement of the public is always critical, particularly because of some of the public relations problems that the stormwater utility concept has had over the years. This fellow who sued the city of Bellevue and was on the advisory committee, when we got all done asking all the questions, he became our biggest supporter.
Yeah.
When he understood what the problems were, when he understood what the financial implications were, and when he understood the equity of that you can attain with a service fee rate methodology that you can't attain in some of the other funding mechanisms. Property rates, property taxes are based on how much the property is worth.
Yeah.
Not only that, there are many tax-exempt properties.
Yes, there's a fundamental disconnect between stormwater impact and
Sure.
how much you pay in
have all
rates.
these public properties in a typical community that don't pay property rates, don't pay property taxes, but they discharge stormwater,
And
just like a private property.
This was my initial interest in this when I first met Andy and this topic came up, and Andy Hornbuckle from Spell introduced me to this concept. My initial interest was, oh wait, conceivably, and maybe the price has to be kind of high for this to work, but conceivably, once everyone is paying for their stormwater, you also then have an incentive for low impact design and
Yes.
some on-lot.
Yeah, that's
some
part of it, and
on-lot mitigation.
that is fundamentally part of the utility user fee concept.
Yeah.
that if a customer can diminish the demand they are placing on the systems and services, you reduce their fee.
Yes.
And so that's for the equity objective.
Yes.
It's a technical objective to satisfy legal standards, but it's also just an equity objective in a community. Now then,
but it also fits with what a lot of science says about what our waterways need. There's some arguments about if we want to, in an Australian context, achieve stream flow objectives, for example, that a very sensible thing to do is, well, don't try and combine the runoff from our pervious surfaces and our impervious surfaces, and then try and use some downstream system like a wetland or a bioretention system to then infiltrate some of that back out. You'll never come close to mimicking natural hydrology. But if you capture water on site, off your roof, before it's combined with pervious surfaces, and before you've mixed it all up together, arguably mimicking natural hydrology might just be a little easier. So.
And one of the tricks of doing this well is to be able to integrate properly that physical objective with the financial approach. And so, it's a balancing contest as much as anything of understanding how you fit, how you match the institutional and the operational and the financial components together, and so that you've got something that really works. And I've been faced with some very, very skeptical people in the course of setting up utilities who, once they understand what you're really trying to do, once they understand the implications of changing who pays for stormwater, they become actually big supporters of it. I'll give you an example. In a typical community, the residential sector, the single family homeowners and so on, pay about 70% of the total property rate revenues.
Yeah.
Okay? In a stormwater utility concept in which you apportion the costs based on service demands that customers are placing on the program and on the systems, the residential portion of the community typically pays between 30 and 33% of the total revenue stream. So you go from 70% to a third. Okay, well, who's paying the rest? Well, the very heavily developed commercial properties, industrial properties, and multi-family residential properties pay a big chunk of that. But those tax-exempt properties, the institutions like schools and universities, and the city itself with its park and recreation facilities and its city hall and so on, and its streets. The streets, if the community decides to have its utility charge the city for its streets, which are, hectares and hectares of impervious. Typically, it amounts in most communities to be 10 to 15% of the total rate base. So that's a huge piece that doesn't pay property taxes, and the school districts don't pay property taxes, and the fire stations don't pay property taxes, and the churches don't pay property taxes, but they all pay service fees.
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately, regardless of who those properties, whether they're the property exempt, or whether they're the tax exempt properties, or whether they're the commercial sites that might be paying anyway, I mean, ultimately the community does end up paying. If it's a commercial site, then theoretically at least the prices go up a marginal little bit and comes back around. But I think the important part of that, at least for me, is that then it creates the incentive for everyone to...
And it adds an element of choice. If the price goes up at the local store so much because of stormwater charge that you don't want to pay that amount to that store, you have a choice of going and shopping elsewhere.
If the local car dealer, the market, essentially.
If the local car dealer with acres and acres of parking lot to put cars on has to increase his price of a car, you may want to pay it or you may not, but you have a choice in that matter. And if you're a property owner and you don't want to pay the full rate, you still have a choice of reducing the demand you're placing on the stormwater systems. You can put in on-site detention. You can take water quality measures to reduce the amount of pollution coming off of your property into the system. And if you can demonstrate that, then your service fee goes down. Another aspect of it, for example, in the States, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits issued by EPA and the states often have a component of public education, where they want somebody in the community explaining what water quality is about.
Sure.
And often that responsibility goes to the stormwater utility. Well, stormwater utilities clean catch basins really well. They don't educate people very well.
Sure.
School districts, schools, educate people pretty well.
Ah, so you could give a school a rebate.
So why not basically contract or give that responsibility to the school districts to conduct a water quality education program through their schools? They've already got the kids there.
Yep.
It's very easy to educate them about water quality when they're sitting in the classroom 5 days a week.
Yep.
Much easier than it would be for the stormwater utility. Well, now what's happened here is that that burden, that responsibility has been taken away from the stormwater utility, reducing their cost of operation. The school district is taking it on.
Yep.
Why not give them a credit against their
Of
service
course.
fee for that very important function that
Yep.
they are performing that helps to satisfy the requirements of the national and state permits?
Yep.
And so we see school districts that get very significant credits against their stormwater service fees by providing water quality education, which they do much more effectively than the utility ever could.
I like it. Okay, I like where this is going because I've learned a bunch of new stuff about this, particularly for me, that reframing towards process rather than outcome. So I've come to this going, oh, I can see why a stormwater utility might be really.
I should share the graphic of the process with you.
Okay.
It's a flow chart that covers those 4 tracks of work through 3 distinct phases. One is the feasibility assessment,
Yep.
and then there is the development and implementation phase, and then there's the post implementation.
I have a funny feeling I might have seen that from Andy.
I suspect you have.
Yep.
Yeah, Andy and I have worked a lot together and
Yep.
worked a lot on that process.
Yeah. So for me, this has been a really good chat because it's refocused me from, okay, maybe I think a stormwater utility is a useful answer, but equally I've had some concerns about what will the community think, but ultimately should reframe that to, well, there's a process here, trust in the process, and that if a stormwater utility is the right answer, it will probably also answer the community concern side. If you
And
get
I
the
would
process right.
reframe the issue of what will the community think to how do we communicate to the community what
Okay.
this really is.
Okay.
And that's when the transition occurs in at least a lot of people's minds of, oh, you're going to tax the rain,
Yeah.
to you're going to address a problem that the community has and you're going to apportion the costs in a different way than it has been historically. And for the most of the residents, that's a much better
Yes.
way. They bear less of the expense rather than more.
Yeah. I like it. Well, do you have any final thoughts you think we should share before we wrap this up?
I think that the most important thing, and I have done this in every community I've worked in, a couple hundred of them, one size doesn't fit all.
Okay.
There are some people in this business of setting up stormwater utilities who have a template and it's a round peg,
Yeah.
and they go
Tunk, tunk. Yeah.
everywhere with their round peg and they bang it into square holes and triangular holes. In my case, I go everywhere and try to deal with the circumstances as they exist in a given community. Some communities can afford they can afford a Rolls-Royce stormwater system.
Yep.
Other communities, they can only afford a Holden or a.
Yep.
The point is that it's absolutely imperative to tailor it to the local situation. One size doesn't fit all. You can pound that round peg in the square hole. It doesn't work very well.
Yeah.
And I have blown that trumpet for 40 years. Some people ignore it, some people accept it.
Sure. Okay. So that's trust the process, let the process make sure that you create the right peg for the right
That's right.
hole, and then whatever comes of it, comes of it. So,
And,
okay.
and the client's got the choice.
Yep.
Don't want to do it? Fine.
Yeah, walk away. No
At the end of the
dramas.
day, that's not my issue, that's their issue. My job is to show them what the alternatives are and how to get there.
Yep. Okay. I like it. Well,
Yeah.
thank you for making the time to chat. It's quite early in the morning, but we've found
Yeah.
the time. I appreciate it. It's
Obviously,
good.
I like to share this
Yeah,
with
I,
people.
I can tell. It wasn't hard to get you
Oh.
going on the topic. So.
Yeah, you get me rolling, and then you have a problem, you have to try and shut me up.
It's all good.
Okay,
Cool.
thanks,
Thank
Jack.
you. Have a good one.